It's Graham Butchart here again, and welcome back. Friday, the 17th of April. This is part 3 in the journey through the Genius program. And just as a reminder and a recap as to why I'm doing this and what this is about, first and foremost, just a big welcome to everyone. And thank you everyone for viewing and watching parts 1 and 2 and sharing that on and talking about it, because it does appear to be reaching quite a few people, and maybe, just maybe, some of you, 1 or 2 of you, maybe more, are extracting some value from these interactions. As a reminder as to why I set off to do this, I feel that right now in the current COVID-19 lockdown scenario, many people may be challenged with enormous concerns as to where they go forward, what's happening with their businesses, their careers, how they're managing themselves through the emotional turmoil that's present, we've adjusted to some extent, but it is awfully real. Well, they may just be asking some bigger, deeper questions about life in general. And I just wanted to remind everyone, and perhaps introduce to everyone through this work, that we're all actually remarkable. Human beings are incredibly adaptive, we're incredibly resilient, we're incredibly inventive, we solve things, we really can show up as remarkable human beings when we choose to. And we've all seen the opposite of that to some extent. You know, sadly around the world, people are behaving in atrocious fashion, performing and saying the wrong things, doing the wrong sorts of things as well. But we have that positivity in us. And that positivity is enlivened when we access our whole intelligence. And that's the reference that I make to this work, the Genius program, this little book that I've talked through, and I am talking through, and I continue to talk through it. And what it does is it recognizes the fact that we are all born genius. We are gifted with a wide range of intelligence. Those intelligences can be seen in 4 very simple areas. There's a lot going on, but they can be categorized or defined into 4 very simple areas. That's our operational intelligence, which is about goal setting, our performance intelligence, which is about the results and the outcomes of what we do. Then there is creative intelligence, which is about vision setting and use of imagination. And then there is the emotional intelligence, which is about ourselves, who we are, what we're about, and importantly, how we show up as human beings and interact with each other, because we are, after all, a social species. So my sense was that I could help you and you could help others if we had a better understanding that we can actually, all of us, access the genius that we are. Now, I've mentioned this in part 1 of this program, part 1 of this video offering, and I repeated it last week in part 2. I'm just going to recap on a few things so that we are constantly reminded of what the possibilities are. So we're all born genius, but unfortunately many people, and most people probably under the ages of about 25, maybe 30, thereabouts, were exposed to a form of education. I call it the industrial education model. And that industrial education model placed an emphasis and a preference on those first 2 intelligences that I referenced, the analytical and the performance intelligences. What are the goals and how are you going about achieving those? And for 17 years of our lives, our neuro pathways, the operating system that we are, were governed and leaned towards those 2 intelligences. We really worked those 2 intelligences. most of us became pretty good at those two intelligences. And we carried that on. We carried that on into our careers, into our life, into our corporate environments, and so on. And that emphasis on those two intelligences actually limited to an extent, and I'm very broad here, speaking very broadly, not everyone is like this, but generally most of us then were to some extent disempowered in the use of these other two intelligences, the creative and the emotional intelligences. And what we know now, today, in this really complex, uncertain world and the environment that we're living in, is in fact, it's those two intelligences that we were underskilled in, perhaps, or underutilized, that are becoming more and more important in terms of how we face the challenges ahead of us. The challenges ahead of us are about us, so there's the social aspect of it, the emotional aspect of our intelligences. And the challenges ahead of us require our remarkable creativity to leverage and discover new ways of doing things. So that's why there is a drive today to seek our access to these two very important and intuitive intelligences. So we're all born this way, but because of the repetition of 17 years of industrial education, many of us underutilize or are disempowered in terms of our creative and emotional intelligences. The Genius Program is a program in 3 parts that is designed to help us re-access or re-enliven those intelligences so that we're utilizing all of our intelligences, that it is not biased in one way or the other. So what is important to understand here as well and recognize and acknowledge is the neuroscience of this. Neuroscience today can tell us that our brains are actually wired for creativity. Okay, unlike other species who's wired around input and output, we are wired around input, but we have this incredible capacity to consider then how we output. And that process of considering how we output is conducted in what we know as the prefrontal cortex, that region of the brain that sits just here behind the forehead. And that is our higher intelligence. That's our processing center. That's the part of the infrastructure that allows us to be considered, to be considerate, to be caring, to understand, to have empathy, to have compassion, to be able to stand back, use our intelligence to consider our options, to weigh up our options, to access our levels of creativity, etc. So we all have that capacity, okay? But many of us are still governed by what we now also know as habit thinking, okay? And that habit thinking is the kind of thinking that leads us to just going from input to output in an instant, and then recognizing later, oops, that was a terrible decision, or that was a bad output on my part. I shouldn't have done that, or I should have thought better about that. And that reactive state comes from habit thinking. So in the first part of the book, which we explored in part 1 and part 2 of this video journey, was to actually look deeply into those areas. And let me just repeat those areas so that we are all clear about them, okay, so that we can all just remind ourselves of what those were. Okay, so we're locked in our habit. I read the other day something really remarkable. It said that, we are prisoners of our past experiences. Prisoners of our past experiences. That speaks to the habit. That speaks to this idea that we just repeat things. We just form. Off we go. We do the same thing again and again and again. And part 1 of the book is really about recognizing that if we want a different experience. If we want to access those two really powerful levels of intelligence, those creative and emotional intelligences, so that we can access all of our intelligence, utilize the analytical and the performance as well. If we can have that blended experience of our intelligences, then we need to also then see and realize that we're being governed by a lot of habitual thinking. And that habitual thinking comes in the form of what I referred to as voices of judgment. Okay, and those would be the voices that sit inside you from past experiences, influential people in your lives, usually parents, siblings, teachers, people in authoritative scenarios who have told you to do things in a particular way, and that has become stuck and has become modeled as habit. Their intentions may have been good, they may not have been good, but we have acted on their instruction year after year after year, but now we realize that maybe, just maybe, those voices of judgments are no longer required. So that was the first thing. Frames, I talked about frames and how it is important to recognize that we are all born into certain frames or adopt certain frames of thinking. Okay, we can be born into a particular religious belief or religious outlook. Okay, it may hold us very, very well. It may serve us very, very well. But there may come a point in our lives when we need, or we choose to expand beyond that, or let go of that, explore alternative options. Okay? So frames can govern us. Fear governs us. Okay? Fear of being allowed that our thinking falls into fear. And how to recognize that, oh, I'm in that fear space continually. So the other areas of habit thinking that we talked about in part 1 and part 2 was story, the narrative of who I am, that ongoing story that I tell myself, this is where I've come from, therefore this is where I'm going, that we actually can change that narrative of who we are. Okay, if we know it, if we're conscious of our habit of thinking, our habit of storytelling regarding ourselves, we can alter that story, we can change that story. Okay, I talked about comfort thinking, okay, and how many organizations reach that point of comfort thinking. Well, human beings do it as well. Okay, they get to a point where everything's working. Why change it? Okay. And then the final area of habit thinking was the commentary that we adopt, that social commentary that conforms us to doing things the way it's been done before. Okay, don't change it; it isn't broken. Okay, all of those cliched commentary pieces of communication that we throw around, particularly towards younger people. That's not within your KPI. Stay focused on what you need to do. Okay. That's a good idea, but that kind of dialogue. So the first part of the program was really about you investigating and logging the thinking habits that you've adopted and you've become unconscious to. That's the kind of thinking that's determining the actions that are leading you to the next decisions in your life. If you don't know what they are, then you're just going to carry on doing what you've been doing. But if you want a different outcome, you have to first acknowledge, this is my thinking, and as a consequence, I can see where this is going. Then start recognizing, these are the things, this is the stuff I need to let go of. And as I mentioned last week, part 2 of this discussion, there are rituals around letting go of things. We can acknowledge that I've got this thinking, I've got that thinking, but it's no longer served me. Time to let it go. Time to be free of this uncomfortable, unnecessary thinking. So part 1 was very much that. What is my thinking? Where is it working? Good. Where it's not working or where it's indifferent, Now is the time to start shifting that away from this just unconscious behavior of thinking, this unconscious stuff, to start really seeing it for what it is. And it's no longer serving us, it's limiting our potential, it's holding us up. It's the thinking that's creating the same outcomes. Okay? Separate that, know it, let it go, thank it for helping us so far, and now it's off on its way. In the second part of the book, which we began in greater detail last week, okay, I introduced, and the second part is about liberating ideas. That is thinking that will help start to introduce more creative thinking to who we are and what we are. But before we delved into that, I also did that exercise with you around content and context, and why it is so important when you're challenged with really complex situations. Most of what we challenge today with are complex situations, that it is important to separate out, to stand back from whatever it is you're dealing with and consider, well, what is content here and what is context? Okay, so I gave you those exercises. I showed you the 9-dot challenge, where you had to join 9 dots using 3 straight lines that must touch each other. And for many people, that's a mental struggle. That's a huge challenge. And we realize that we're trying to stay within the confines or the context of the square that was formed by those 9 dots. We realize that it's only once we liberate ourselves from the mental confines of the square of the 9 dots and we free ourselves, that we're actually, the problem is resolved when you look at the context, the bigger area. And then I played a trick on you and I told you about the cat and the mouse on one piece of paper and how that was solved by separating out the context, by creating 2 independent contexts. And it's a big problem there, because I think many people really default in their immediate thinking into being stuck around the surface level of everything. You know, we look at the surface level of the problem instead of pausing, standing back, seeing the content of what's going on, and then, well, what surrounds this context, this content, and that's the context. So looking at context is important. So go back and look at part 2 again if you want to. I then moved into the liberating ideas, and that's really much what the focus of today is going to be about, is focusing and spending some time on these liberating ideas. And I began to introduce these ideas to you with a view to realizing and recognizing that many of these new ideas, or ideas that I present, are not necessarily new ideas to you, but it may just be that you're not utilizing them to the extent that you could be utilizing them. So we've got this habit thinking. If we acknowledge that we've got habit thinking that isn't helping us and we let go of it, we need to be using different kinds of thinking to help stimulate and create different neural pathways, different positive habits that enliven these other intelligences, this creative and emotional intelligence range that we all have. Okay, so get rid of stuff that isn't working, that habitual stuff that's negative, and introduce to your life, okay, some of the liberating thinking that can work. Okay? And I talked about observing with presence. Okay, let me go back over that a little bit, because I hurried through that. I'm conscious that I hurried through that to some extent. Observing with presence literally is about recognizing and acknowledging that your most powerful sense is sight. Now, many people are blind, okay, so they're deprived of this. Okay. What we know about people that are deprived of a sense is that their other senses are often heightened. Okay, so they hear, or they smell, or they can touch and have greater feeling. Okay. But I'm talking about the sense of sight, okay? And I'm talking about how awesome it actually is when we really use it, okay? Which is why I call it observing with presence, or presence being in the moment and utilizing the moment to really be observant, to go beyond that surface, superficial looking that many of us just do, that quick glance, okay? Spending time and actively being conscious about what you are seeing gives you more information. You're receiving greater input. You're accessing more data, okay? And if you access more information, you're in a better position to make a better decision going outward, okay? So the superficial glance that most of us just do, that casual, lazy observing, that observing not in presence, that observing whilst I'm busy doing something else in my head, that's lazy observing, okay? And I told you, and we did a little exercise, and so let's just refresh that for a moment, okay? Lift up your hand, bring your hand up in front of your face, okay? Turn it with the palm stretched outward from you. Look at your fingers, look at the contact, look at the skin, look at the folds, look at those lines, okay? Really study those lines. Be aware of those lines. Bend your hand. See the magnificence of that infrastructure moving under your control, unconscious to you, but you're actually controlling it. It's your system operating, moving, but observe it, okay? Study it, look, okay? That is a sense of observing in a present way, observing with presence, okay? And if we really take moments, longer moments of observing with presence, as I say, we get more information in, we start to see, oh no, hang on, that jersey isn't red, it's actually a burgundy, yeah, okay? That person's eyes are actually blue-gray. They're not gray, they're blue-gray, okay? I can see something further than just this superficial glancing process that we go through. It's a way of really exercising the muscles of observing. So that's one of the first liberating tools. That's one of the tools that we need to be far more conscious of. We need to be far more expressing in. We need to really use our ability to observe. Okay? So hold up other stuff. Okay? Just really take things in. Okay? When we look at each other with greater detail, we see more about each other. Okay? We become more conscious about each other. This, by the way, is linked directly to empathy. Okay? If we're attentive in our observations of each other, okay? If we're more observing of each other, we may well pick up certain little telltale signs that will help us understand maybe what that individual is struggling with, or maybe what that individual is going through. Okay. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond, way beyond just our individual observing each other. It goes much deeper into all sorts of other aspects of what we are as well. So I put a big emphasis on this. Observing with presence is one of our key liberating tools, and we need to use it far more consistently. So start introducing that into how you are experiencing your world. I then spoke in part 2, and I'm going to repeat it here now, about feeding the soul. And feeding the soul speaks directly to music. And music is an incredible liberating tool. Okay, we do this unconsciously. Okay, we'll switch on the radio, we'll switch on our iPad or whatever, our musical device, we'll switch it on. And off we go into that unconscious state with our music, that unconscious relationship with our music, in and out, consciously in and out. When we hear the words of the song, we sing along maybe, okay, we start moving around. But music can operate at a really deep level because it resonates, because the human body resonates. Okay, we are energy. That's what we are. We are energy. So if our energy, okay, is low, if our energy isn't feeling good, if our energy is sluggish, if our energy is apathetic, and I turn on a piece of music that ignites and generates me, my body energy changes. Okay. So I can go from being sort of lethargic and apathetic. I can suddenly go into, wow, superpower. Okay, here I am. Bit of something there hitting me in a really powerful way. So music does that. Music's remarkable. Okay, you'll all have had the experience of listening to music, and maybe it's made you feel melancholy. It takes you back to an idea, a period of time, or makes you feel happy. You've also listened to music that when you listen to it, you just want to get up and jump around like a 4-year-old. And that's exactly what we should be doing more of. We should be using music to enliven who we are. So I said to a number of people, draw up and create your top 10. Okay, start populating your music list. Start finding those top 10 pieces of music that cause you to get up and actually start moving. Okay, so it's a tool that can help you when you become aware of your lethargy, you become aware of your apathy or your low level of energy. Okay, hit that music. It changes you, it shifts the mood. And it might not just be for a moment or two. It might be that this is something that you need to do for a period of time in order to really shift where your thinking has been sitting. Okay, so in exploring music, you also come across, if you're courageous enough to sort of go out and do this, you can find music from all over the world. You may not understand the words of it, the language of it, the meaning of it, but you will feel how powerful that music can be. So access music. So what I tell people to do is create a top 10 list, have them on hand, okay? And when you feel that need, switch it on and then off you go. So feeding the soul is the second liberating tool that is in the book and I wanted to talk about with you. The third liberating tool is huge, okay? And I call it the power of questions. And this comes directly back to this industrial education that many of us were exposed to as well. So as I said, for 17 years, generally for 17 years of most of our lives at an adolescent level, we were introduced to wonderful subjects, but most of the delivery of that subject was done on a question-answered basis. It was linear in its thinking, and we were given a set of material to consider, and then we were tested around a particular answer. And if we got the answer correct, we got the right mark. We tick, off you go. Right? So what that taught the brain, our minds, to do was, one, assimilate the knowledge around that particular subject, but also to follow a certain rigor and pattern in terms of considering options, providing an outcome. Okay, so this linear and linearity behavior of, right, what are the considerations? Here's the result, were the instantaneous mechanisms that became part of our neurothinking, part of our patterning, part of our habit. When we consider questions, and we consider the right kind of questions, so open-ended questions as opposed to closed questions. So, for example, do you like chocolate? Yes or no, right? Whereas an open-ended question would be, tell me about what types of chocolate you enjoy. That opens the spread of the questioning. We need to utilize questions in a far more rigorous way, in a far more familiar way. We need to be conscious of how we engage with each other, and we need to be considerate of the fact that it is a question that leverages different outcomes. Okay? So instead of that lazy habit of just trying to provide an answer, go for bigger questions. Okay? And two stories here that resonated with me hugely to enforce this. The first was by Einstein. Einstein was asked at some point, once he became a recognized and acknowledged celebrity, and he became renowned for his intelligences, somebody once asked him, considering all the world's problems at the time, okay, and this was back in the sort of 50s or so, in the past century, he was asked, if you had an hour, sir, if you had an hour, how would you go about solving the world's greatest problems and challenges? And his response was considered, and he said he would spend the first 55 minutes designing the questions. I think that kind of sums it up. If you invest in the questioning, well, then the answers automatically cascade outwards. And that's the power of questions. The other gentleman that did this very, very well, and actually kind of gone under the radar a little bit about his magnificent idea, was a gentleman called Trevor Bayliss. Now, Trevor Bayliss invented something called the wind-up radio. And the wind-up radio was renowned and hugely impactful because it helped limit the spread of AIDS and HIV in Africa. So how does that relate to questioning, you might be asking? Well, it relates in the following way. What Trevor Bayliss did, Trevor Bayliss was a stuntman by occupation, by trade. And he used to, after a day on the set, he would go home, and many of us do this, he'd go on, he'd put his feet up and he'd sit and watch TV. And the one evening he was sitting watching a documentary on the television about the HIV pandemic in Africa. And as he was watching it, questions were forming in his head. Why is this pandemic such an issue in Africa? That was the first question that emerged, right? So there's a level of question that emerged. And if you look at that level of question and you stay with it, a number of answers will cascade off of that. A number of answers will cascade off of that. And one of the answers that cascade off of it in his head was that the AIDS pandemic is because communication isn't that good in Africa, right? So next level of questioning, why is communication such a challenge in Africa? Okay, and off the back of that came all sorts of answers, things like distance, different languages, reach, and out of it came power supply to allow people to access things like radio and television. Okay? So next question was, why is a power supply such a challenge in Africa? Okay, and then again, off come the back of that, off come the cascading questions. Well, huge distances, poor infrastructures, difficult terrain, underskilled, limited resources, all sorts of things like that. And then came a critical question for him, which was, again, off the back of that. Well, why does transmission require power? Okay. Well, if I'm trying to transmit a piece of communication or information, why does it require power? Okay. And there began the magic idea in his mind. Okay. And he literally that night, that evening, he started to manufacture in his kitchen, downstairs in his workshop. He pulled things from the kitchen. He pulled all sorts of gadgets together. And he invented, overnight, he invented the wind-up radio. Okay, so he took a whisk, kitchen whisk, he took an old transformer, and he engineered a system that if you wound up the device, it created sufficient energy, okay, internally to receive a signal, and therefore receive the transmissions. And Trevor Bayliss's wind-up radio, okay, helped limit the spread of HIV in Africa. So questions are always more powerful than answers. And if you can start to use open-ended questions, okay, so questions that open the situation up. Oh, you feel like that? What makes you feel that way? Okay, well, that's an interesting observation. Can you add to that? That's a point of view. I'm interested by your point of view. How could I add to that point of view? What causes you to see that in that particular way? How could we collaborate on this in a different way? So start to study, go and explore open-ended questions. By the way, if you want to reach out, I've literally got pages of open-ended questions that will open vision, questions that open action, questions that open all sorts of things. So if you're keen and you're interested in accessing questions, then send me an email, graham@grahambutchart.com, and I'll send you my list of questions. So power of questions, very, very important. So then first tool, remember, was observing. Second tool, feeding the soul, which is all about music. Third tool, power of questions. Now let's look at a really other interesting area in which our thinking can become enlivened, breaking the routine, breaking the norm, and that is play. Okay, so I call it play for thinking, and we've all seen this, we've all witnessed it with young kids. Okay, so, and we all tell the story. We've all told the story. We'll tell the story about how young children are given a gift. Okay, they're given a toy. They take the toy out of the box. They put the toy on the shelf, and they use the box. Okay, because the box presents them with so many more alternative options than the toy does. The toy presents an option. Okay, so after a certain period of time of exploring and using that, the toy only lives a certain amount of time. The empty box opens up all sorts of potential for us. So over the years and doing work in a corporate environment, I came up with this idea. It's called the magic bag. Okay. Again, if you want to know more about this, you can always email me around this. I just recently did a little video for somebody because they were confined. And so I explained to them exactly how this magic bag works. Okay. And I did it as a little video. So in this magic bag, there are all sorts of insane bits and pieces. Well, when I say insane bits and pieces, they're just actually bits and pieces from all around the house. Okay. So I found here what is a bit of brass piping. Okay. That brass piping, okay, would be to connect water or gas. Okay. So it's full of all sorts of different things. Let me get something else out of here. Okay. I've got a plug, a domestic plug. Okay. So now you might think, well, that's very smart, Graham. You've got all this bag of goodies. Okay. So how it works is this. In a corporate environment, and because our thinking is conditioned to operate in this linear way with seeking answers, if you said to a group of people, you break them up into small groups of people, and you say to them, right, I've got a challenge for you. Find or tell me about a social problem that is a real challenge to solve. And as I say, I do this in group. I've done this in groups of people, with groups of people. They say to them, break them up into smaller groups. Right. The one group will say, right, okay, yeah, drug abuse amongst teenagers. So I'll say to them, right, spend the next few minutes discussing how you would go about solving that particular problem. And what tends to happen is we fall into that same methodology of approaching a challenge and approaching a problem. And what we end up with is the same kind of outcome. So what you'll hear, if you observe this, you observe, so each group are doing something. So around the room there are 20 people, in groups of 5, they're all looking at some social problem, whatever it is, traffic congestion, pollution, whatever. But the same methodology of thinking is occurring at every single table. And the first is that a certain individual at that table is now leading the group. They've taken ownership of it, which results in maybe 1 or 2 of the group just easing off a little bit, okay? Perhaps maybe just getting disengaged, okay? And they're working through the same sort of formula that they would approach. So the leader in the group, the individual in the group is writing down stuff, and there's a discussion going on, but it's very low key, it's very deliberate. So what I do at that point is I pause the room. I say, right, everyone stop. Okay, just stop doing what you're doing. And I then ask them, everyone to take an item out of the bag. So everyone takes one item out of the bag. Okay, and they all look a bit puzzled and they all look a bit confused by this. Then I say to them, right, using the same tool, okay, using the same subject and using these different tools now, go about solving the same problem. Okay, so drug abuse with children, right? So what then happens is this remarkable stillness, this silence takes place, this closing down in the room. It's just like uncanny quietness, these strange looks at one another. What's this about? What's going on? And then a remarkable thing happens, is that so somebody in the room may have picked up the plug, right? So oh, we've got to plug it, we've got to plug, we've got to stop it, right? This is a stop, isn't it? So we'll just stop it. And the giggle starts and the play begins. Okay. So instead of now approaching very deadly serious problems with a serious fixed mindset, what they're now doing is they're expanding their mind and they're looking at different opportunities. And then they start to see other things. So they might start to see, actually, there's a chain here as well, okay? And a chain speaks to linking ideas together, okay? Chain also speaks to the weakest link, doesn't it? You know? So where's the weakest point in what we're trying to do? And these conversations expand and they go further. And somebody's got the join, okay, or the bend, the couplet that bends. Okay, there's all sorts of possibilities here once you start playing around with these ideas. And when that process starts to happen, when they start to utilize the single items and build solutions to the problem, their heads take off, they start exploding. And they come up with all sorts of different ideas. And it's really quite remarkable. I then tell them to stop doing that after the same sort of duration that I'd given them to look at it in the first instance. I said, in the first instance, here's the challenge, go about doing it, 3 or 4 minutes. Then I stop them again after 3 or 4 minutes. Okay. And the outcomes are poles apart. First of all, they've got about 4 or 5 ideas on the table already. The second thing is, when I ask them, well, what were the different experiences you went through? Very clearly what happens immediately is they recognize that no one's more important than anyone else, that everyone's idea is equal. There's no leadership, there's collaboration, okay? There's no one dominating idea. There are alternative ideas, because it's freed and laughter is apparent and play is apparent. They're just all sorts of different cascading possibilities coming up. So that's just an example of playing with thinking, all right? But there are so many other ways of approaching that concept. And the trick here is to start to consider that now, and particularly in the confines of where we are today, in the lockdown environments that our businesses are operating in. How do you go about using play to create different outcomes of thinking? And that's where games are important. That's where gamification is important. That's where we know that, and the neuroscience of this is incredible. If you allow a person to attach their thinking to a particular color or a particular point of view that they hadn't considered before, suddenly you get this flourishing of different ideas. So play with the thinking, avoid the typical corporatized approach to problem solving, avoid it at all costs. It only leads to the same sort of outcomes. Okay? So you can do anything. You can literally create any kind of tool or mechanism that causes that process. The other interesting thing about the magic bag, which is often comes back to me, and I recall this now, is that creativity actually performs exceptionally well when you tell people you've got a limited frame in which to work. So if you give somebody a piece of string, you say, right, allow your thinking to stay with a piece of string, there's an amazing thing that happens upstairs, and that is the ability to see that piece of string beyond just being a piece of string. So it becomes all sorts of other narratives, and that's that expansion of the creative thinking that's occurring. So play for thinking is the fourth liberating thinking tool. So I'm conscious of the time today, and I'm conscious of the time today is because I have an appointment at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to wind up a little earlier today, but I'm going to wind up with the fifth liberating tool, which will take us actually to the end of section 2, which means that next week we can focus completely on section 3 of the program. And so this fifth area of liberating thinking is around very, very powerful part of what we are, and that is universal law and intention. So universal law is quantum physics. Okay, and that might sound awfully scientific to you, and awfully complicated, and awfully deep and mystical and strange and everything else. But we need to understand that essentially human beings and everything is made up. Everything in this universe that we know of is made up essentially of the same two very small little particles. So you and I, as we sit across there, we know each other as human beings, but that is just the form in which this structure of particles has come together. The bookcase behind me and the books on the bookcase behind me are also made of the same fundamental particles. Okay, and that, I know that rocks people's minds. They find that sometimes a little bit weird and a little bit odd. But at its very foundation, in other words, if we take very, very powerful microscopes and start looking further and further into things, what we ultimately end up with are these two little powerful pieces of these powerful particles. And when we go further into that, what we also understand, and what is really truly astonishing, is that there is energy and there is communication. Those particles are moving and they're also interacting with each other. So energy and communication, that's what we are. That's really, in essence, all that we are. And all things have this astonishing energy and communication. That's what we're made of. Little particles, energy, little particles of communication. Which is why when we're active and when we're communicating with each other, okay, we feel good. Okay, pretty simple. It's pretty simple. Okay, but that energy and that communication goes beyond just that superficial level. It speaks into this big concept, this big idea of intention, and how powerful intention actually is. And I have a reading list, by the way, and if you're interested in that reading list, please let me know. Again, email me, graham@grahambutchard.com. But there's a woman that wrote a book called The Intention Experiment, Lynn McTaggart. And that's a very, very good book. It's a very good book because it gives you here, it's very simple to read, it's not complicated. And it gives you a historical perspective of our inquiry into intention. And this links back, by the way, to universal law. These things sit together. Intention, universal law. So that those particles of energy and communication link directly to intention. In her work, and it's a body of work, it's a remarkable body of work. Lynn McTaggart's inquiry and interest goes back historically to when we first started to expand and consider, okay, what is going on with communication? What is this process that's taking place? And part of it was very, very interesting because she speaks to the very early work that was done by FBI agents using simple lie detector processes. And all a lie detector is a monitor on your skin that measures your pulse. Okay, and then with the right questions, it can determine, okay, the baseline of your responses. Okay, so if it's off the charts, it knows that you're demonstrating some sort of uncomfortableness, therefore that question, etc. So, but what these early police detectives were doing is they were messing around. Okay, here's the playing, the thinking, right? They were messing around with the machine one Friday afternoon, probably after a couple of beers. And what they did is they took their device and they hooked it up to the pot plant in their offices. And they asked the pot plant some questions. And an amazing thing started to happen. Is as soon as they asked the questions, they saw the needles of the pot plant responding. Okay, yes, bizarre, right? They realized that all living things have this mechanism of response. There's a communication happening at a really deep scientific level. That goes back to the universal law, particle communication, energy communication, energy communication. When we say something in our head, okay, it has power. That's what an intention is. Lynn McTaggart's work went further and she discovered that actually intentions have their own wavelength, travel on their own wavelength. Sound travels on a wavelength. Okay. Intention travels on a wavelength. Okay. She started putting this to the test, and the test is clear. The tests that have been done on this are astonishing. And you will have probably done these tests yourself. That's a reminder for me to wind up. So let me just close up on this test. You'll have done this test, and that is because we all have mobile devices. How often have you just paused and thought about somebody else? You thought about a friend or someone close to you, and a little while later, okay, the phone rings, okay, and there is that person. Now, the amazing thing about this, when I've done this, when I've asked groups of people this in numbers, in big numbers, Now, I've asked people in the room to please put your hand up if you've ever experienced that. I have yet to be in a situation where an individual hasn't put their hand up. And there was this sense that we actually have this capacity to reach out, okay, with an intention toward another person is that powerful. Okay, so our thoughts are hugely, hugely influential. So I'm not going to have enough time to really dig deeply into this. So we're going to pick this up again next week when we meet. But in the meantime, I want you to think about it. So let me just wind up the day then. First part of this book was about you doing the work, doing the inventory in terms of finding out what are those habits of thinking that are holding you up, that are limiting your thinking, that have prevented you from moving forward, that are causing you to just keep showing up in the way that you're showing up. Okay? If you want a different outcome, you've got to create that change inside your thinking. Okay? That's where it's going to come from. So the first part, very much, right, let's identify this stuff. Having identified it, let's let it go. As we move into the second part, we start realizing, well, what are these tools? Okay, and I've talked about these tools today. So let's just wind up by going back through them quickly. Observing with presence. That is to say, really start using your sense of seeing in a far more effort and present way. Okay, be much more diligent about what you see, because more information coming in provides you with a better option going outwards. In other words, the decisions I make going outwards will be better informed. The power of music to lift and change your thinking. Use it. Create a top 10. Questions are more powerful than answers. Stop that lazy habit of seeking an answer. Create more questions. Okay, it's what kids do. Kids ask questions. Adults should be asking far more questions of each other and themselves. Ask deeper, open-ended questions of yourself. If you're interested in the vocabulary, send me an email and I'll send you my list of questions that I have. Play with your thinking. Okay, so don't just fall into the habit and the routine, that pattern, that lazy pattern of going to the same kind of thinking over and over again. Create different tools that are going to cause you to have more fun and more play with your thinking. And then start thinking about, okay, the power of your intentions. And we'll talk more about that when we meet again next Friday. So thanks for showing up. Okay, thanks for being here today. And we just hope that maybe this kind of stuff can help in some way with what's going on in your world at the moment. All the best for the moment. And cheerio. Thank you. Goodbye.